Welcome to The Rebound with Coach Matt Doherty.
Welcome to The Rebound. I am Matt Doherty, and I'll be your host. On this show, we explore remarkable rebound stories of resilience and recovery. We highlight the leadership qualities that emerge in the face of life's biggest challenges, revealing the strength and determination within individuals that inspire us all. With me today is someone who's won at the highest level of basketball and also faced his share of adversity. Our special guest today is Mitch Kupchak. Mitch was an All-American at North Carolina and the 1976 ACC Player of the Year. He also won a gold medal on the Olympic team in 1976 in the Montreal Olympics. Drafted 13th overall by the Washington Bullets at the time, in 1976, Mitch played 9 seasons, winning championships with the Bullets in 78 and the Los Angeles Lakers in 1982 and 1985. After retiring, he became the Lakers general manager in 2000, overseeing 7 NBA championships during that tenure. In addition, Mitch earned his MBA at UCLA's Anderson School of Management in 1987, preparing him for his executive career. Mitch, thanks for being on the show.
That's great to be on, Matt. Thank you.
Yeah. Take us back to Brentwood, Long Island. Growing up on Long Island, what was that like for you as you played basketball in the parks of Long Island? What lessons did you learn?
Well, anybody, of a certain age would know, like, Long Island really didn't exist, prior to 1950. There was a big war, right? World War II. And, a lot of the veterans came back to New York. My dad was one of them. And there was a shortage of apartments. You couldn't get an apartment. And everybody was looking for a place to live. And Long Island at that point was, pretty rural, a lot of farming, a lot of agriculture, even Nassau County, right? And there was a guy named Levitt who decided to plan a community, and he built Levittown, which is, right next to Hicksville and really right next to where you grew up in East Meadow.
That's right.
So my family moved there, into a Levitt house in 1950. It was 2 bedrooms downstairs and then a staircase that led up to nowhere. It was just an attic, right? And if you wanted to, at a later date, you can convert the attic into a bedroom or whatever.
Right.
There was a little teeny TV, about that big, built into the wall. And as a veteran, I think my dad had to put down $50 to get the house. And then when you move in, you got the money back. Okay. So that really was, Long Island at that point. Now,
right.
We lived in Levittown for 10 years. Then we moved a little further out to Brentwood, which, the further east you go, the more farming and, agriculture that there was. Having said that, Brentwood was also, somewhat of a planned community, a lot of tract housing. Mm-hmm. I grew up in an area where there was block after block after block of 12 houses per block, right? So plenty of kids to play, plenty of things to do. I loved baseball. I was a baseball fan growing up. And when I became of age, like 1960, 61, the only team in New York was the Yankees. The Dodgers and the Giants had already left for the West Coast, right?
Right.
And the Mets didn't come about till like 1960, I think 1 or 2. So I grew up a Yankee fan and a baseball fan. Mm-hmm. And my dad was a mechanic, an aviation buff, working on cars, heavy construction in the city. And that's pretty much what I was tracking, right? I loved airplanes. I loved watching my dad work on things, lawnmowers, cars. He always came home dirty at night, right? Had to go into the bathroom and get out the Gojo.
Yeah.
That stuff that got the grease off your hands, right?
Yeah.
So, but baseball was my sport. You know, as the seasons changed, I played football. There was always kids around. You just walk out the front door and there was dozens of kids to play with, you know, your age. So it was never a problem to get some kind of a sporting event going, right?
Well, I want to dive deep into that because I think that part of growing up, playing pickup football, pickup baseball, pickup basketball, the lessons you learned there, the lessons that generation, our generation learned of being creative, taking initiative, like leadership. Somebody's got to say, hey, all right, Mitch, you and I, let's pick teams. We're going to play stickball today. We're going to play basketball today. Let's go to the park. We're going to meet there at 3:30 after school, and you and I will choose teams. And here are the rules. And then there's an argument about a call, and then two people have to negotiate. You know, those things are missing in a lot of, I sound like an old man, right? Well, we are old men, but I think those things really helped us navigate through life a little bit. What lessons did you take away from playing pickup, say, basketball, baseball, football, growing up in Brentwood?
Yeah, well, Matt, you're touching on, you know, sports and how sports helps prepare you, you know, for the future. You know, maybe people who run companies, they look to hire people who play sports because they know, you know, that there's some discipline, there's some dedication, there's a work ethic. You know, most times, you know, you listen to coaching, you know, you just don't kind of go off on your own. And I think sports in general, you know, it's a good ramp, right, to business. You know, even if at some point you don't get to the NBA, you don't get to the NFL, right? It's great training.
Right.
And, you know, growing up in Brentwood, I was baseball and football, which really you just needed a street or the back of a building, you know, to throw a Spalding against, right? Mm-hmm. Basketball courts were a little harder to come by. You know, back then there weren't that many indoor courts available to anybody. Right. Today, you know, major cities have these gigantic complexes with 18, 20 basketball courts. You know, none of that existed then. You know, there were some outdoor courts at the high school. There was some outdoor courts that we had to drive to. As I got older, you know, I would play at Rockville Center.
Yeah.
You know, which I'm sure you played at under the lights, right?
Yeah, Hickey Field.
And then in high school, I would play in the city, right, in the record tournament or just different leagues.
What was some of your best memories? Like, I'm thinking about, you know, the Rucker. I regret one thing. I never played at the Rucker in Harlem. But, you know, Long Island, like, obviously Dr. J came just before you. Right. Jeff Rulin was just after you. Right. Frankie Alazier, you mentioned, from St. Agnes, was a great high school player at St. John's. Take us back to, you know, playing in the Rucker, and what was that like, especially for a white guy from Long Island?
Well, you mentioned a bunch of names, some of which I did not play with in high school, right? I ended up playing against, you know, Dr. J in the NBA, and of course Jeff. But Frankie Alazier from St. Agnes was my year in high school and college. Beaver Smith went to Southside, was also my year, right?
Beaver Smith.
And I had a couple of good kids on my high school team too. So, you know, we kind of bonded together. You know, Frankie's dad would, you know, set us up. You know, we'd get in the car. Sometimes his dad would drive. Sometimes I would drive. Sometimes Frankie would drive. And we'd go where the games are, because that's how you get better. You get better by playing against the best. The Rucker tournament was outdoors, you know, and I remember, you know, driving up, you know, for a game and getting out, going for warm-ups, and there's literally nobody around. And then within 15 minutes, you know, it's like 10 deep behind the basket on the sidelines. And all of a sudden you had a big crowd, right?
Right.
And a lot of cheering, appreciation for the game. And, you know, the Long Island guys, we did good. We had a good group. Frankie went to St. John's, Beaver went to St. John's, and they had great careers playing for Luke Carnesecca. So The competition was great. Frankie was a great teammate. He played the right way. As a point guard, he made sure everybody got involved. He sacrificed what he could have done. Maybe was shoot the ball more or whatever. But everybody did their thing. Beaver was a great shot blocker. And, I was a big, long, gangly guy. At that time, I was 6'9", maybe 210, right, 215. But very competitive games.
So talk about, again, the lessons you learned. You have guys coming from different high schools, different socioeconomic backgrounds,
Right.
You, Beaver, and Frankie, and now you're playing as a team, and you have to shelve some individual, maybe accolades. Maybe you want to shoot the ball more, but
Right.
maybe you got to rebound, play defense. Beaver maybe scores more, but you intuitively have to feel that to come together and do it quickly, right? Tell us how you develop that awareness, kind of a self-awareness and emotional intelligence
Right.
in high school, and you don't even know you're doing it, really.
Well, I think you touched on it earlier when you talked about coaching. You just don't show up and know how to play, right? My game was baseball, and I got into basketball because I just grew. Frankie was, I think, 5'11", right, at the most 6 foot. He got into the game because he loved the game.
Yeah.
And I was kind of a raw talent, and Frankie was, understood the game better than probably anybody. But we all came from really good coaching,
Yeah.
a good background. And in this case, and I mentioned Frankie because we're talking about the Rucker tournament, right? But there were a lot of other players that I played with, that knew how to play the game. But he was kind of the leader of the pack. He would get everybody together. He would come up with, sidelines out of bounds, stuff like that.
Right.
I pretty much, even through college, even in the NBA, I just kind of did what I was told to do, right? I was never, let's face it, big guys don't bring the ball up their court, right? They don't call plays. They have a pretty well-defined role.
Mm-hmm.
But we all had to play as a team, and we all had good coaching. And
you've talked about coaching, and I'm glad you do. I'm an executive coach now. I as you know, I used to coach basketball, and there's really not much difference because you are recruiting talent. I call it the organizational triangle. Every organization has talent, systems, and culture. You recruit talent, you put them into a system, and you drive a culture. Right. And I think more and more about my high school coach, Bob McKillop, and Dick Zeitler, and then Dean Smith, our college coach. We shared the mutual college coach. Your coach, Stan Kellner, basically saw in you something you didn't see in yourself.
Right.
Tell us about the story of him approaching you in the hallway when I think you were in 8th or 9th grade.
Yeah, I was a baseball player. I actually played some football in junior high. I played 1 year of high school. I was one of those guys that was really, really tall. And every time I saw somebody, the first thing they said was, you must play basketball. And, I loved baseball. So I kind of, I don't know how you say it, resented it a little bit. And because of that, I tried to stay away from basketball. But what I couldn't stay away from was, the genetics. I just kept on growing. And when I was in 9th grade, actually in 8th grade I played. I was like 6'1", and I was putting away the trampoline one day, getting ready for practice, and it folded up and hit my wrist and broke my wrist. Right? Oh, I couldn't have been happier. Okay, the season was over, and I didn't have to play basketball. Okay, and then in 9th grade, I was now 6'6", and my wrist had healed, so I had to play basketball. And I was about 6'6", I don't know, 140 pounds. I looked just terrible in the uniform. I was already self-conscious, because I was 6'6", and then now I'm so skinny, and And, at that time, the smaller players, the guards would bring the ball up and down the court. And by the time I got to the free throw line, they would have shot the ball, right? I'd have to turn around and go back the other way. So I don't know about you, but I didn't think that was fun. Okay. So after my ninth grade season ended, we had a coach at the high school, Stan Kellner, who was a good coach. And he had a couple, 3 good years there at the high school. And of course, word got out that there was a 6'6", 6'7" guy, at East Junior High. And he came one day and, they ring the bell, classes change, and he nailed me in the hallway. He knew what class I was coming out of. He stopped me and he went nose to nose with me for about 20 minutes. And,
first time you met him?
Well, I had met him at a game, but really the first time I spoke to him for more like 10 seconds.
Right.
And, it was a little embarrassing, very self-conscious, right? This guy grabbing me in the hallway, all my, classmates walking by, looking up at me, wondering who this guy is, why is Mitch standing there, and he basically had my summer planned. He had a vision for me that
right.
At that age I did not have for myself.
Right.
Just didn't.
That's leadership, vision. You got to cast a vision. He had a vision. He believed in you before you believed in yourself.
Yes, 100%.
OMJ Clothing is an elite men's clothing store that provides a vast array of spectacular brands of men's lifestyle apparel for every day. Elevate your business upscale casual at OMJ. Success comes from standing out.
And he got my mom on board, because when I came home that night, she said she spoke to Mr. Kellner. Okay. And I knew what that meant, right? So, my summer of kind of hanging out and, playing baseball and with the guys or whatever was scripted. It was basketball camps, summer leagues, high school, open gyms, stuff like that. And I did it, maybe I knew deep down that there was something here. I don't know, but I didn't feel that way at the time.
Yeah.
But I did it. And we had a pretty good high school team. So I made it through the summer. The guys on the team, 2 guys, Jamie Franklin and Ray Valentine, would come pick me up, in their car, and we go places and just play pickup games.
Yeah.
Right. So they showed some leadership that I had never seen before. They took the reins, right? Mm-hmm. And they loved the game. They wanted to win. And whether it was by design, by talking to Mr. Kellner or whatever, right? They took some initiative and they wouldn't let me go sideways, right? They got me and developed a bond, a good creative bond.
Well, you're talking about the names come, your names. Now I'm thinking of my high school teammates when I was a freshman. Bobby Testa would pick me up, take me to practice. Mike Aldridge the next year would pick me up and take me to practice. Matt Feeney the next year. Then finally as a senior, I could drive myself to practice. Yeah, that is not unlike how I grew up. But the unselfishness of those upperclassmen to take you under their wing, right, and kind of show you the way, teammates, that's a good teammate, right? How did you, because I know you were a great teammate and you were great to me. Like when I got to North Carolina, I wasn't going to play with you, but I got to know you in the summers, and we both from Long Island. I worked your camp. You made me feel a part of the team and the program. You pass that forward. You become a junior, senior. Now you're one of the best players, not only on your team, but Long Island and in the country, and you become highly recruited. How did you kind of pass that forward to a sophomore or freshman at Brentwood High School?
Well, like you said, they exhibited some leadership, right? How old are you between ninth and 10th grade? I don't know, 14, 15 years old, right? Not old enough to drive.
Right.
So when I became of age, my junior and senior year, right, they graduated and I knew what they did, right? So that's what I did.
Right.
Okay, at North Carolina, when I got there, when you got there, might be a little different. Well, it is a little different today, right? Because they're one and dones and the transfer portal. But then you came in as a freshman, right? And you left as a senior.
Yep.
And when you got there, you had a pretty good reputation as a really good high school player, right? But now all of a sudden you're playing at North Carolina and you got to not exactly start from scratch, but you have a lot to learn. And, the juniors and seniors at North Carolina, they kind of showed me what needed to be done when I became a junior.
Yes.
It's called leadership, right? That's what it's called, leadership.
Yes, it's a mentorship, leadership, onboarding, that first experience, the adjustment, you go to that next level and I remember it and we've shared it with each other, but for the group, your first experience playing, whether it be, pickup at Chapel Hill, Carmichael Auditorium, tell us a little story about what that was like for you to go up against, you're talking about some of the best of the best. What was that like for you and who was on the court?
Yeah. I've never been in the military, right? But you watch movies, talk to my dad, when you get there, you're in boot camp, right? You're lower than the low, right? You have to earn your stripes. And as freshmen in North Carolina, we were freshmen. And my year was the first year of freshman eligibility. So nobody really knew if I was going to play that year or play on the JV team, right?
How about that?
Yeah, so people were watching closely. And freshmen lived on a different floor than the upperclassmen in the same building. Okay, we lived in an apartment building called Granville Towers.
Yep.
And the freshmen lived on the fourth floor, and everybody else lived. So there was a clear separation. And when you got to the gym, we played 4-on-4. The seniors and the juniors and the sophomores would pick each other. They would pick the teams because if you win, you stayed on the court.
Right.
If you lose, you had to go wait, until 2 or 3 more groups before you were called again. Which was similar to playing playground basketball right in New York. Right?
Yeah.
You had to win.
Touch on that for a second. I want to interrupt. The importance of that and what lessons did you learn when, winners stay, you lose, you sit, right? What did that teach you?
Well, I think you just said it, pretty accurately, right? If you wanted to play, you had to compete at the highest level.
Right.
And, you couldn't, shoot the ball every time, because if you did, you might not win the game, right? You had to figure out to do the things to win the game so you could stay on the court.
Right.
Because a lot of times you show up to play and maybe you're the third game, right? So you waited a half an hour for the third game and you're out there and it's over in 10 minutes.
Right.
And you lose. Now you got to sit an hour.
Right.
Right. It's really a waste of time.
Right.
So you had to learn to play. You had to compete at the highest level. You had to rally your teammates together. You got to say, hey, listen, we got to block out. We got to get this rebound. You got to stop that guy. I got your back. All kinds of stuff like that.
Yeah. So it becomes peer-to-peer coaching, and you have to be willing and have the self-awareness to, if you're the upperclassman, to coach the underclassmen. And as an underclassman, you go from being one of the best players in high school basketball in the country to now you have to listen to an upperclassman. And if you don't, you might not be fitting in. You might not be right for that program.
Yeah.
Or you're going to learn some hard lessons.
Yeah. Everybody came in as a highly recruited All-American at North Carolina when you were a freshman, right?
Yep.
And obviously playing high school basketball is different than playing at North Carolina. So I don't want to say you had to be humbled, but a lot of times you were humbled pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Whether it was by the competition on the court or the way maybe an upperclassman treated you, right? You had to earn it.
Or Coach Smith treated you.
Or Coach Smith.
I'm gonna tell a quick story. My freshman year, we're playing pickup at Carmichael. Probably one of the first times I played with you, and I remember seeing you and Tommy Lagarde, another All-American NBA player.
Great player.
You and he played together, and you guys are both like 6'10", 250, knocking the crap out of each other. And I'm this skinny freshman from Long Island, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like I didn't see this in the Catholic League on Long Island. And my first shot, and I'm playing against Dudley Bradley, who's an all NBA defensive player, 6'6", as you know, super athlete. And I'm like, my first shot sailed 2 feet over the basket. And my confidence was shaken. I'm like, do I belong here?
Yeah.
And I remember an upperclassman, a former NBA player at the time, teammate of yours, John Kuster, taking me under his wing, going to Woolen Gym, the auxiliary gym, working on our shot, running down to the golf course and back.
Right.
And he gave me the confidence. He's like, hey, I've been there. You're going to be fine. You're going to be okay. And that meant so much to me. But I'm in one of the workouts, I'm wearing a McDonald's All-American practice jersey. So I was a McDonald's All-American. They didn't have that when you were a senior. Otherwise, you would have had one too. So I wear that, and I'm entering into the basketball office, up the stairs to the right. And Coach Smith comes out, and he looks at me and looks at my shirt, and he said, oh, that'd be a nice shirt for your brother John. And just walked by me. He made me feel that big. I never wore that shirt ever again.
Yeah.
Right? That was
great.
his way of putting me in my place. Like, you're nothing special here. Like, everybody's a McDonald's All-American. And right. John Beilein, a legendary coach at Michigan, had a great line that I used. He had a talented freshman, and he told the freshman, he said, fit in before you stand out. And I think that's what we did at North Carolina. That was the culture. That was the culture. So go back to your story about playing 4-on-4, pickup. And I remember the story about Bobby Jones and your nickname. I'd like you to share that one.
Oh, yeah. Well, Bobby had just come back from the Olympics, 1972. And we were still playing 4-on-4, right? He took a little bit of a break. And, the one thing I was good at, which is different than the way the game is played today, there was a big low post presence back then.
Yep.
Big guys go down to the low block, right? And in North Carolina, it was always like, go to the block and we'd get you the ball, right? Because, that was a high percentage shot back then. There was no 3-point shot, and there was no shot clock. So, at that point, I was about 6'9", about 225. And my last 2 years in high school, I built a bench, a weight bench out of 2x4s and 2x6s in my garage. And I got a set of Dan Laurie weights, right? And I was living in the garage because I was so thin and so weak and so self-conscious. But anyway, I put on some weight, I got stronger, right? And my high school coach was a great low post coach, right? So he had me doing these drop steps.
Right.
And I had a pretty good, strong drop step baseline, right? So Bobby, after a couple of times when I just kind of like dozed him over, started calling me the dozer, right?
For Dozier is short for
bulldozer.
Bulldozer.
So my first year there, he would call me the dozer, right?
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. That's funny.
Yeah, I may have been able to, doze him once or twice, but he was so quick off his feet, that he probably caught more than I dozed, but that was the name.
all-pro defensive player for
Yeah.
what, 10 plus years.
Oh, yeah.
You know, the thing that jumped out, nobody told you to build that 2x4 bench
Right.
in your garage.
Right.
So you did that. You mentioned being self-conscious. I think insecurities drive us sometimes, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so the insecurity of I'm tall, skinny, I stand out, I look awkward, I'm going to do something about it. You're either going to shrink and fit in, or I'm going to embrace it and get bigger and stronger and own it. And then to take the initiative and be resourceful to build your own, bench press in your garage. Those are the little things, right, that show you did now take the game seriously. You did like what the game maybe brought to you, and you had to fall in love with it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have achieved the success you achieved. I want to touch on some things you played with, worked with the biggest names in the game. I'm just going to go down some names, and if I miss one you want to add, please do. Stan Kellner, high school basketball, legendary coach on Long Island. Dean Smith, one of the greatest, in my opinion, coaches of all time in any sport at North Carolina. Pat Riley with the Lakers. You worked with Jerry West as an executive for the Lakers when he was the general manager. You played with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Magic Johnson, James Worthy, who was a teammate of mine as well at North Carolina. And then you had to, you didn't have to. You had the pleasure of being the general manager for Kobe Bryant, Shaquille O'Neal, and Phil Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
Those are Hall of Famers, the best of the best.
Mm-hmm.
What were some of the lessons that you stand up? If I said Dean Smith, Pat Riley, Jerry West, Magic Johnson, tell me maybe a story, a leadership type of impactful story that jumps out when I say those names. So Dean Smith.
Okay, well, I would like to mention Dick Motta at Washington. We won a championship together. He was in the Hall of Fame as a coach. Gene Shue was my coach there for 1 year as well. And, the last 7 years I've been working here in Charlotte, right, for Michael Jordan. Okay.
Who?
Yeah. Well, you would know who he was because you played with him. So, Jerry West, I think about 10 years ago, wrote a book, My Charmed and Tortured Life. And I'm sure maybe you've read it, maybe you didn't.
I've not.
If I ever wrote a book, and I won't, it would be titled, My Charmed Life. Because I don't know, how some of those things happened, right? When I went to Los Angeles, Paul Westhead was the coach, and Pat Riley was the assistant. In December, Dr. Buss decides to make a coaching change, and Pat Riley and Jerry West have a press conference, and Dr. Buss introduces Pat Riley and Jerry West as co-coaches, right? And Jerry is at the press conference, and he looks at Dr. Buss and he goes, no, I'm not coaching. He's coaching. And he points to Pat Riley. So that's how Pat Riley got his start as a coach, right? So clearly, I didn't plan that, right? The stuff just kind of fell into place. Working for Michael here in Charlotte, I'm not sure I would have worked for somebody else, but I knew him from afar as a North Carolina, player. Mm-hmm. And, we had gotten together from time to time and play golf, but I didn't know him that well. But I wanted to work for him, so maybe I had a couple of choices, that I made, but a lot of the stuff, Coach Kellner, right? He just happened to be the coach in high school when I was there.
Right.
So a lot of it was luck. Maybe I recognized it, maybe I didn't. I know I like to work. Okay. And I followed instructions. It didn't matter to me a whole lot if a coach wasn't a good coach. I just did what he said. I grew up like, he's the coach, You know,
Right.
I never felt I had the cachet to get into it with the coach, right? So I was always very coachable. I always listened. And, we touched upon my dad earlier, right? Different era, growing up in the 20s and the 30s, being in a war. But he worked hard every day. And I saw him come home every night, tired and greasy.
Yep.
And, maybe I like to work. I still like to work. So,
Yep. So what?
I don't know
When I say Dean Smith, tell me, like, I look back to key moments in sports, not just basketball, that you were part of. Playing Duke at home, down 8 with 17 seconds to go. You talk about adversity. You talk about crucial situations. What was it like in the huddle at that timeout with 17 seconds to go? What was Dean Smith's, not only what was he saying, because 50% of communication is body language, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we tend to remember. Tell me what his body language was like and what you remember from that timeout.
Well, we played in Carmichael. Carmichael was already half empty. People had already left. Bobby was fouled, and
Bobby Jones.
It was a timeout, and in the huddle, Bobby didn't make the free throws yet, so we were still down 8 with 17 seconds to go, right? And you just mentioned Coach Smith was, looking up at us. He had that little grin. He was smiling a little bit. He squatted down, right? We were in the chairs. And I remember him saying stuff like, isn't this great? We have a chance here to do something. We're going to win this game. Bobby, I want you to make these 2 free throws. After you make the free throws, our defenses were numbered, right? So I forget what the number was. And he would say, listen, steal the inbounds pass, make a layup, and call a timeout.
Right.
So Bobby made both free throws. There was an inbounds pass. I'm thinking maybe Kupchak stole it. I'm not sure. Fed Bobby for a layup, right? And now we're down 4, timeout. Right. And Coach Smith always saved his timeouts.
Right.
So we had plenty of timeouts. And we go to the the huddle, same thing. Just, and now we're starting to think, well, wait a minute. We're down 4.
Right.
And his confidence, and as you said, his presence.
Yes.
Right. He had that voice. I don't know what you'd call it.
Yeah.
Can
you imitate? Can you do a Dean Smith imitation for us?
No. But the word is a nasal voice, right?
And Mitch, did he call you Mitchell or Mitch?
Only 2 people in my life have called me Mitchell. Okay. One is my mother. The other is Dean Smith.
That's right. Dean Smith. Right. My family, immediate family, will call me Matthew, and Dean Smith called me Matthew. And Matthew, the last time you threw a pass like that was in St. Raphael's Grammar School. Yeah, like he knew where you went to grammar school. He knew your brothers and sisters. He would say, Matthew, wouldn't that be that McDonald's All-American shirt would be a good shirt for your brother John? Like, he didn't have to say John. He could have said my brother, but he knew. He was so smart. That behavior, can you develop that behavior of his calmness, body language in a timeout? Can you develop that as a leader? Were you able to, you're not as a GM in game-like situations, but you're in stressful situations. Could you take on that persona?
Well, I'm not sure if you're talking about me, but in general, yeah, he grew up his dad was a coach, right? And he majored in math. I believe he got his master's in math, right? And he was also in the military. Okay, so that's a pretty good start, a pretty good foundation, for leadership.
Yep.
But the answer is, if you want to learn, yes, you can. You can develop. Now, I never really saw him lose it. You know what I mean? And be out of control.
Yep.
Probably with you, I've never ever heard him say a cuss word.
Never.
And I'm talking about like damn and hell. Those
Right.
two words, and of course the other words. Never, ever.
Yeah,
Okay.
amazing.
Sometimes when I did something wrong, I wish he would have cussed me out.
Instead of saying, Mitchell. Yeah.
You know, so some of those things, I don't know how he developed that skill, but you know, I've cussed, but in leadership, I've tried not to ever, you know, dress down, you know, a coworker or a player. You know, I've gotten angry from time to time, but I think most of it was planned.
Mm-hmm.
But some of that stuff, you know, I did learn from him. Now, my high school coach, you know, his vocabulary was pretty varied, right? But yeah, Coach Smith, I don't know how he did it. He was,
it's amazing discipline. Amazing discipline.
Great and a great memory, right? Just a great memory.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So let's move to Pat Riley. You played for Pat Riley. Give me a story. Well, let's go back to the Boston Massacre. This was you're playing the Lakers in the NBA Finals, and you're playing in Boston, and you lose by 45 points, right?
Right.
So that take us. What point of the series was it? What were the games?
Okay.
You know.
Okay. Well, I came to LA in '81 as a free agent, right? And you know, I was the power forward, supposedly for the next 6 or 7 years. And in December, as I mentioned, I got hurt. I torn an ACL. They didn't know how to repair it then, so I ended up having a couple of surgeries, but I missed about 2 years. Okay. And I did play for Pat for 2 months before I got hurt, but then I missed a year and a half, 2 years, right? And I came back in 1984. You know, I was a backup center. I had a big brace on my leg. You know, when I ran, you know, I would limp a little bit. So I wasn't nearly the player I once was, right? So in '84, we played the Celtics. And I didn't play a whole lot, but we got beat in, I want to say 7 games in Boston. Now, the Lakers had played the Celtics in the finals like 9 times. Jerry West played in 8 of them and never won.
Wow.
Okay, so when we lost in '84, you know, it was like, oh, here we go again. So the next year, '85, you know, we ended up playing the Celtics again. And the first 2 games were in Boston. And it was on Memorial Day, and we got beat by 35. At that point, I was backing up Kareem, so I was playing a little bit, right? So we got beat by 35.
35 or 45?
I don't remember. It was a boatload.
Okay.
It was a boatload. It wasn't even close. It was humiliating, okay? Because we knew what they were saying in LA, right? Oh, here we go again.
Yeah.
You know? So
what was Pat Riley's message after that game to the team?
I don't remember because he didn't say a lot after the game.
Why? Let's go back to that. Why? Because Dean Smith didn't either. Yeah. And it was part of their philosophy.
Yeah. Well, I've always thought, okay, you know, even as a GM, you know, the worst time to talk to a coach, you know, or a player is right after the game.
That's right.
Okay, you're up there in the stands, you're sitting, you're relaxed, you know, it's not really the heat of the moment for you.
Right.
But as you know, when you're on that bench or you're in the game, you know, your emotions, the tension is sky high, off the charts. And I've always felt the worst time to talk to a coach, and I was in the locker room every time as a GM, talking, just being there in case the coach wanted to say something to me. Mitch, call the league about this referee, but I never, ever criticize a player or a coach right after the game. It's the worst time.
Yep. And as a coach, I know Dean Smith didn't do it because he didn't want to make an emotional evaluation. He wanted to watch the film.
That's right.
And then he would say, he says, sometimes we could play well and lose, or we could play poorly and win. He wanted to watch the film first before he made comments about our performance.
That's right.
Yeah. So going back to after the game, the messaging, you lose to the Lakers by a boatload. You're down in the series and you're going back to LA. What was Pat Riley's response? How did he, or, maybe the real leader of the team was Magic Johnson, or maybe it was Kareem, or maybe it was somebody else. Tell us about the leadership roles on that team at that moment.
Well, that was game one. Game two was in Boston. I think that was a Monday. So we had Tuesday, we had practice, and we had a meeting first. And for at least an hour, maybe an hour and a half, we watched film of the game. And Pat took it upon himself, because Kareem did not play well. And he figured the only way that we were going to win that series, is if he got more out of Kareem. Mm-hmm. So he went back and forth on the tape, showing Kareem maybe not reacting, not getting a good second jump on a rebound, not running the floor, kind of effort things. Yep. And he was very, very critical of Kareem. It was clear that the purpose, one of the purposes of that meeting, was to jump Kareem. Mm-hmm. Okay. I do remember him. His dad was a baseball player, and he did tell a story to us, that his dad told him. I'm gonna kind of paraphrase it, but it was kind of like, at some point in everybody's life, you're going to have to plant your feet and make a stand. Wow. And this, so that's what he was challenging. He challenged Kareem and he challenged the team. Now, everybody, had their moment on the film where they didn't do something right. It wasn't just Kareem, but the focus was really to challenge Kareem.
Question for you. Do you think that he talked to Kareem before the meeting and said, Kareem, I'm gonna be hard on you. I need you to take this for the good of the team? Or do you think that Kareem, just being, a high character guy, took it and knew that he deserved it and he needed to take it because he was the captain? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, Matt, I don't know. Pat was smart enough to know to maybe do that, but I don't know if he did it or not.
Yeah. And Kareem was mature enough to take it?
Kareem doesn't get enough credit. Of course, Hall of Fame, all those years. But to me, he was a consummate teammate, professional. He practiced every practice. When he got hurt, it was rare. He played with migraine injuries. Of course, statistically, you just look at his numbers, but I still don't feel he got enough credit. He was a great teammate, and he was very coachable, right? Coming from his high school, and of course, John Wooden,
right?
Who coached him in Milwaukee? Larry Costello, I think, was it? Is that who it was?
Yes.
And then in LA, Jerry West, and Jerry said, Jerry knew he wasn't a coach. He was much too impatient. But Kareem always respected the position.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you have that meeting. Take us from there.
Well, yeah, but then we had a knockdown, drag out, grueling practice. A lot of drill work, scrimmaging. And after, getting beat by whatever, and then being called out in a meeting like that, those practices are physical. You're up and down the court, you're knocking your teammate over, you're responding, right, to what the coach, coach challenged you,
Yeah.
right, called you out, right, and you're responding. Some players, maybe Kareem could have reacted differently. And surely he could have. He could have crawled into a cave, right, and said, "I'm not, don't you know who I am?"
Right.
But he didn't. And it was one of the rougher practices that year. And then the next day we played and we won the game. So now it's 1-1 going back to LA.
Yeah. And you ended up winning that series.
Yeah, back then it was the format was 2-3-2.
Mm-hmm.
So we won that game and we won 2 of the 3 back in LA. So now we're up 3-2 and we win game 6 in Boston. And Kareem is MVP of the series.
I love that. You won game 6 in Boston.
Yes. Yep.
What was that like? I mean, that's Larry Bird and McHale and Ainge and
right.
I listened to a quote, James Worthy. There was this special on the Lakers and the Celtic rivalry, and James's quote was not one that Dean Smith would have used. It was F the Celtics, and so but to win it in Boston, game 6, what was that like?
Yeah, on the parquet floor, right? That was kind of the expression when we got back to LA. As I mentioned earlier, the Lakers had never beaten the Celtics. So this exercised a lot of demons, for like Jerry West, and Bill Sharman and Gail Goodrich and Jim McMillan and Elgin Baylor.
Will
Chamberlain, right? So to beat the Celtics for the first time on their home court, we still lost to them 8 other times, but that first time, it was like, okay, we did it. We can do this. So, and some of us as players, I grew up a Knicks fan, right? And, some of us as players didn't go through that experience, but we were able to, when we returned to LA, you read the papers and the people are coming up to thanking you. You realize, this just wasn't a regular championship game. This was a game that excised demons for the last 15, 20 years.
Yeah. I never thought of it that way.
Yes.
Wow. Well, for the sake of time, Mitch, I'm going to jump to a couple of things here. You talked about generations, and you talked about Kareem being coachable and being able to take the hard-natured coaching of Pat Riley,
right,
and being a consummate teammate. Then you move into the front office where you're working with Jerry West, and then you've got another generation, a new generation, Shaquille and Kobe. What did you notice in the difference, maybe, of generational shift in terms of being able to hold them to the level of accountability that Kareem was held to by Pat Riley?
That's an interesting question, Matt. Well, Kobe was drafted as a 17-year-old. Okay, and Shaquille was a free agent. We got him when he was 24 years old. He had already gone through 2 or 3 years of college and was in Orlando for 4 years, right? So he was a seasoned veteran. But Kobe actually signed a contract with us when he was 17 in August. Wow. And then when he turned 18, we had to sign another one because he wasn't of age for the first one. And I think he turned 18 in November, I think. So, and Kobe did not go to college, right? He grew up overseas and played high school in Philadelphia. And we drafted him as a high school senior. And nobody really knew at the time, other than maybe Jerry West, what Kobe was going to turn into. Shaquille was a prize, right? A free agent, he was a prize. Everybody knew who he was. Kobe was so competitive. Even as a 17-year-old, he thought he should be playing 35, 40 minutes a game. And his first year or two with Del Harris as a coach, like he didn't start his first year. I'm not even sure he started his second year. Mm-hmm. Right? And then I think his third year he started, and we all know what happened, after that. But he was so competitive. He had his blinders on. His work ethic was off the charts. His skill level. If Pat Riley was the coach, yeah, Kobe could have done it. Mm-hmm. He would listen, but he was anxious, right? His confidence set him apart from everybody else. Shaquille, he had to respect you, okay, as a coach. If he respected you as a coach, okay, then the team was in good shape. If he didn't, then that could be a problem.
Yeah.
With Del, who is now in the Hall of Fame, with Kobe being so young, he was tasked with developing that team. And, we won a lot of games every year. We got to the conference finals, but never got to the promised land, right?
Right.
And then we bring in Phil Jackson. And, Phil just came off 6 championships with Chicago. Mm-hmm. So now that automatic respect is there, right? And he ran an offense that was good for both Kobe and Shaq.
Right.
Low block, triangle, mid-post, elbow, which Kobe thrived on. So Del kind of paid the price for developing the team for 3 or 4 years when Kobe was 17, 18, 19.
Yep.
And it's a shame he didn't get to experience, right? Yeah. The fruits of his labor. But Phil came in, and we won 3 in a row.
Yeah. What was it like being around Phil Jackson? What is he like? What's his secret sauce? What's his magic? What's his gift?
Yeah, well, we had a pretty good relationship. He had a great voice, right? That deep, coaching, really deep voice, right? That would, at practice or at a timeout or in the locker room, would resonate, right? When he said something, and then he would whistle during games. He would have this whistle.
Yeah, I talk about that as a coach. I couldn't whistle. I had to stomp my foot, and to this day, it takes me about an hour to get out of bed because of heel spurs. The gift of whistling is used. Pat Riley could whistle too, couldn't he?
Pat did, I think. Yeah, I don't remember. Yeah. But did Coach Smith stomp his foot also?
He would do this. He would clap and point. Yeah. And if it was at a referee, you were okay. But if he clapped and pointed at you, that wasn't good.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember how he got my attention. Phil had credibility. He had just won 6 championships, right? When you win 6 championships in a row, and you're addressing the team, you're running a practice.
Yep.
You're going to get some leeway. Like I said, he ran an offense that was great for our team, and he was different in a lot of ways. I'd come into the office sometimes in the morning, and my office was right next to his, and I'd sniff around and say, "What is that smell?" Right? And the 2 assistants would sit there. Oh, Phil was walking around, spreading incense. And I said, "Well, did he go in my office?" I said, "Yeah, he did." Good karma, right? And then my window from the offices would oversee the practice court. And, one day he had, the yoga instructor out there, putting our players, with the lights out, through yoga. And I'm not going to mention, but a couple of the guys did fall asleep, right? And then at Christmas time, he would give every player a book.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not just a book, like the same book for everybody. He would, by getting to know that player, he would figure out the kind of book that he would want him to read that would be a self-help book, right?
I love that. I heard him on a podcast, and I'd love to get him on on this podcast. He talked about the difference between a transactional coach and a transformational coach. And I never really thought of it that way. But when I think of Pat Riley, I think of a transactional coach a little bit more like, here are the plays. We're going to put you in these positions. We're going to execute these plays. Where Phil, his whole offense, was really giving to the players, putting you in a structure, but giving you the freedom to make decisions with the ball. Yeah. And doing the yoga and giving them books and trying to transform them. The term coach, and I may have shared this with you before, came from a town in Hungary spelled K-O-C-S, where they built horse-drawn wagons to take people from point A to point B. So that's the term coach, where the horse-drawn wagons that would transport the people. And, then you think, you fast forward, you fly coach buses, coached the term ended up going to Oxford, where professors will call coaches. This would take their students from, being their beginning of the semester through finals. And Phil Jackson was that transformational coach from my perspective. You got to see him up close, in sense and all.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
He was different, but and he was also really good during timeouts. He had a commanding presence, right? He had a presence on the sideline.
Yep. Presence. I talk about executive presence, the importance of that. It's interesting. Phil Jackson's 6'9", big man, big voice. Dean Smith, let's say 5'10",
right,
and a kind of nasally voice,
right.
You wouldn't say, you compare the two when you look at him, say, "Oh, that guy's the guy you would respect more." Dean Smith had that same presence.
That's correct.
It's interesting how you can develop that presence through emotional intelligence, through leadership, through grabbing someone's heart and getting to know them and developing that transformational leadership. Yeah. I could go on and on. I'm going to ask you a couple of quick questions. MJ or LeBron or Kobe?
MJ.
Yeah. Now, why?
Well, he's got 6 championships, right? He played in an era where there was a three-point line, but nobody used it. And it was an era that was probably 5 times as physical as today's era. Mm-hmm. Now, the last couple of days, if you watch NBA, these games are good. And they're pretty physical.
Very physical.
I'm happy to see the NBA is letting them play. But when Michael played, if he left the ground to go up for a layup, he would get tackled. I mean, literally just thrown to the ground, right? Today, there's no doubt that player would get a flagrant 2 and would be suspended, for 3, 4, 5, 6 games. Okay. So, Detroit, New York, Miami, those games were so physical.
Yeah.
He won the championships. Of course, I'm in North Carolina, right? I gotta recognize he went to our school, right? And you played with him. Yeah, I never played with him.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Michael, I mean, I can't imagine, even Jerry West, right? If they had the 3-point line when they played, and if they got to shoot free throws like the guys get to shoot free throws today, touch fouls,
Yeah.
Michael would have averaged 40 to 45 points a game.
Yeah.
Okay. And he played every game. He didn't miss games. But, on the court, his grace and athleticism, pretty much says a lot. But he won 6 championships.
Yeah.
So that's why I would put him at number 1. And then LeBron and Kobe. Oh, boy. Well, Kobe won 5 championships. LeBron, what he's doing is amazing.
Yeah.
This guy is at his age, averaging 24, 25 a game. It's, that one's tougher for me to rank, but I will go with Michael number 1.
Yeah. If Shaq was available in the draft now, with the way the game is played, would he be the number 1 pick in the draft?
He does not fit into today's game.
Well, what do you do?
Matt, having said that, you take him number 1.
And then do you change your style as a coach? Do you right? You make the other team adjust to you.
You got to figure it out as a coach. If that kind of talent is available, you got to get him and you got to figure it out.
Right. Yeah, that's what I thought. What's next for you, Mitch? You've had a storied life, a storied career. You're still working for the Hornets with the Hornets. What's next for you?
Well, I watch a lot of games, college and pro. My son Maxwell works for the Atlanta Hawks in their front office.
Yep.
So we're always talking basketball. I meet him at college games, and we watch the games together. So, I love the game. Could I picture myself, every day getting up, going into the office, to be a GM, get there at 8:30, stay until 8:30 at night. If there's a game, get back at 11. Maybe.
Yep.
But somebody's going to have to want me too, right?
Yeah.
So it's not like I can just say I want to do that. Opportunity, I stay ready, but I do like the game. And I don't know. There's a lot of things that interest me.
Yeah.
Right. The NBA and, the changing landscape in college. I stayed very close to that this year. With the settlement, the lawsuit, NIL, paying players, colleges are going to have salary caps, stuff like that. So
everyone's hiring a general manager in college. Shaq just signed on as a GM of Sacramento State.
I saw that.
Yeah,
a lot of colleges. North Carolina has already hired a GM, right? So, Matt, I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll see. Right. We'll see what comes up down the road.
Mitch, I hope you'd be willing to join us again. You've been a great guest. You're one of my, as Coach Smith never had favorite players, although he did tell me I was his favorite. No, you're not supposed to have favorites. You've always been one of my favorite guys. And I really appreciate the way you've treated me ever since I set foot on campus at North Carolina to today. You're first class. I appreciate your friendship. And thank you so much for being on The Rebound.
Matt, thank you. I appreciate our friendship more than you would know.
OMJ Clothing is an elite men's clothing store that provides a vast array of spectacular brands of men's lifestyle apparel for every day. Elevate your business upscale casual at OMJ. Success comes from standing out.